we have with us Pierre-Antoine Villanova, who's Director General of Corsica Linea. Hello. Alexandre Adjadj, Marine Technical Advisor at Vicia Assurance. Xavier Lezac, International Hull Expert. Over to you to introduce the roundtable. Thank you very much. It's a vast topic. Atmospheric emissions due to shipping. For the past 50 years and the Earth Summit in Stockholm, this has been a challenge for the planet, these atmospheric emissions. Shipping for a long time was a bit on the sidelines of this evolution, and as of 2005 in the Kyoto Protocol, IMO was clearly asked to set up a protocol for atmospheric emissions. It's later that the maritime and shipping areas took an interest in this area. We're talking about 40 million tons of pollution, but it's 11 billion tons of merchandise transported per year. Per ton transported, therefore, it's something that isn't nil, but it's fairly limited. One can say today, therefore, that these CO2 emissions amount to less than 5% of global world emissions. So it's a phenomenon which is not marginal, but it's very limited. Mindful of these environmental and societal challenges, IMO decided to introduce a certain number of measures. The most famous is IMO 2020, which came into force in January 2020. It's Annex 6 of the Marpol Convention, which had already been signed. Annex 6 entered into force truly in 2005. And IMO 2020, there's a real reform for shipping, and the goal is to reduce emissions of sulfur by 85%, and that would represent about 8 million metric tons per year. These reductions entail not just reductions in the emissions, but also the creation of so-called SICA areas, where there is a limitation in emissions. There are 4 areas in the world where we limit atmospheric pollution: the Baltic area, the west coast of the U.S., the east coast of the U.S. and Canada as well, inter alia. So the goal of these areas is to protect the marine environment and also the coastal populations and activity around these regulated areas. In this workshop, we're going to be talking about this aspect from 2 different sides. Mr. Villanova is going to talk about this standard view from a ship owner, a company, our financial challenges, which are not negligible for the maritime world. And then we'll be talking about the consequences for insurers, the consequences of the new standard. Will there be an increase in claims? What may happen in the future? Because it's a very recent standard. We went through a crisis in 2020, quite a major crisis. Shipping slowed down. Currently, we're waiting to see what the new technologies hold out for us in these new standards. So Alexandre Adjadj will give his technical view about all these issues. First of all, I'd like to call on Mr. Villanova to talk about the stance of ship owners when it comes to this new standards. Thank you. Corsica Linea is a fairly recent ship owner. We're just 5 years old. We were very fortunate. When the company was set up, we were able to create a culture and a vision for the company, and we're a recent company. As soon as the company was set up, we focused on 3 topics which lie at the heart of the company vision. And you'll see through this that the vision we have of the environmental transition is not linked to constraints or standards. It's the real vision we have as a company in the long term. There are 3 topics which guided the creation of the company. First, customer satisfaction, which is essential for us, particularly considering that we took over a company and we changed the former company a lot, made it more dynamic, placed the customer at the center. And so now we rank 5 out of 22 ferry companies in Europe in terms of customer satisfaction. We aim at 15% growth a year. Customers recognize the kind of offering we are holding out for them, and we meet their expectations. And then we have a societal ambition in the company, too. I heavily insist on this each time. Our ferries operate between France and Corsica, and we fly a French flag. That's essential for us. This societal ambition, this ambition to increase the presence of the French flag, lies at the heart of our vision. We seek to develop activity with SMEs in the Marseille port as opposed to big multinational companies, which are also present in Marseille port. That's the vision we've tried to cultivate since the very beginning. And the third topic, which is not linked to a constraint, it's a vision we have. For 20 years, I worked in the environment before becoming a ship owner. We want to achieve this environmental transition. I'm fortunate to have shareholders who are entrepreneurs and not investors, so they give us time. The directives we have agreed upon is a 10-year horizon. Over 10 years, I can invest all my profits in the environmental transition. We have a vision of the environmental transition which is quite pragmatic. We're not people who are going to innovate. We will be quickly introducing existing technologies which have already proved their worth. An energy mix, 3 conventional solutions, the electrification of vessels in port in Marseille. The port is quite innovative. So 3 of our vessels have been electrified. As soon as they dock in Marseille, they use electricity. We have scrubbers as well to reduce our sulfur emissions. And we have ordered new vessels that work with LNG. We're one of the few ship owners to have implemented these 3 solutions: electrification in port, scrubbers, and LNG-driven vessels. So we focus on the client. We have societal ambitions because we fly French flags, and we want to achieve this environmental transition. Now, if you go into more details as to the environmental transition, we really decided to go all the way and to invest heavily for 5 to 10 years to invest all our profits in this environmental transition. The fact we have this vision means that banks understand that our company vision is real. It's not just a front. And they're willing to support us in terms of our values. Hence, we can finance this environmental transition because, in fact, our values are in keeping with the times. Some people want to buy tomatoes as cheap as possible throughout the year, and a growing part of the population is more forward-looking. They buy tomatoes during the tomato season. If they're produced locally, it's even better. And if they're organic, that's great. Well, that's what we're trying to do as well in shipping and in the maritime field. We have a company project which is customer-centric. We have societal values, and we want to achieve this environmental transition. And insurers are prepared to back us. It's a real proposition we have, and we have built up a whole group of players who are happy to support us. Pragmatic environmental transition, what does that mean? We're investing in the environmental transition. We've invested hugely for a company of our size. And once again, we're investing in tried and tested technologies. We're not people who are going to innovate. We use technologies that really work, and we have phased investments. We have bought new LNG ships from Italy and not from China, because in terms of our societal values, we prefer to buy in Europe than in China. We'll be happier to work with a shipyard which is an hour away than people located on the other side of the world. So that's our pace, those are our ambitions. Of course, there are obstacles. Clearly, changes in legislation are sometimes too fast. The environmental demand is so very great that we sometimes have the impression that decision makers want to move on to the most recent innovation. And when we invest for 10 or 15 or 20 years. So we do need stability. We don't want environmental decisions to change all the time. Are we taking the right decision? In 4 years, won't there be a new law that comes out which changes everything? Despite everything, we have decided to move ahead along this path because we are guided by the values I mentioned earlier on. We're guided by this global vision we have for the company more than by regulatory laws or what have you. For a company that's just 5 years old, for the time being, we're one of the rare companies to have succeeded with this environmental transition. We have 3 ships which have electrified. We have new LNG vessels which have been ordered. In 3 years, we've invested heavily in all these areas. And the upshot of all this is that as we feel that environmental transition is one of the pillars of the company vision, we've grouped together with us a lot of partners, a lot of stakeholders, banks, insurers, maritime authorities, shipyards which trust us. Once again, to conclude, there is an important risk when it comes to the fears we have that the rules will evolve too fast, the rules will change too fast, and we won't have time to finish one project before we have to tackle a new one. So these are the main issues that we wanted to refer to. And unfortunately, with the COVID crisis, the transport of passengers has been heavily impacted. That will leave a trace, and it will shift some investment in the environment despite our will. Sometimes it's just a question of dollars and cents, and we fear that COVID will have, well, it has had an impact on our cash flow, of course, less than in our case than in others, but that may delay some of our investment. Change of rules, the impact of COVID, these are things that have been complicated for us to manage. Okay, an LNG vessel. That's for 2022. I'll be off to see the shipyard. The vessel is being built. It will be put in the water in September, and 1 year later it will be brought into service. So despite COVID, we didn't change anything. That's important. In 2020, we chose not to change our investments in the environment. Our investments were underway. The new LNG vessel finished the electrification of our vessels. We were in the middle of adding scrubbers. We could have stopped. We decided to continue to finish this first phase, whatever the cost, because we thought in the future our values are more important than everything else, so we're going to forge ahead. It's not just a front. These are real facilities which are there, and this new vessel will be in the sea in 1 year's time. I suggest, Mr. Judge, that you take over now. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to talk to you about 2 main topics. First of all, using low sulfur fuel as of 1st January 2020 and the impact on the shipping market. Then I'll talk about measures introduced by IMO when it comes to reducing carbon footprint in shipping. I'd just like to go back in time in 2019 with Arnaud Gibret. We prepared at the request of FFA a guide of compliance to the 2020 rules on low sulfur fuel. There were several goals. We wanted to present the changes which would impact the shipping market, present compliance solutions available for ship owners, and amortize or quantify the risks involved in these solutions. We'll talk about that later. And we wanted to advocate preventive measures which should be brought into place in order to create a very flexible transition that wouldn't have too much impact on insurers or on ship owners. Here I'm referring mainly to the change of fuel and the installing of scrubbers. So in a nutshell, the means available in 2019 to be prepared for January 2020 was a policy for cleaning gases, namely scrubbers, retrofit existing vessels. Sometimes that's very costly. It's not economically feasible. Here I'm talking about new constructions. And the most simple solution, use fuels with less than 0.5% sulfur. That's perhaps the easiest thing to do. So what actually happened as of 1st January? What we noted in the course of the year was that most ship owners turned to the regulatory fuels, the low sulfur fuels, VLSFO. 5% of the world fleet is currently equipped with scrubbers. We noted a peak in installing of this equipment in 2019, with about 2/3 of the system in an open loop. And also, a few ships use LNG, 170 in 2020, and the order book is constantly growing. So, what have we noted? 1 year and a half has elapsed, but we can note certain things. A survey was conducted by BIMCO. It did a survey amongst 192 of the participants in order to gain some idea of what ship owners had really done over the first 6 months. There were a whole series of questions dealing with the availability of fuels. That was also a topic in 2019. Will we have enough fuel, the quality of the products, and also the experience, and in particular the bad experiences and all the difficulties encountered. What transpired mainly from this survey was that 62% of those who answered noted that there was an increase in the formation of sludge in the fuel circuits. And that is a very important point, and it fits in with what we noted when we talked with some of our customers. This was a unanimous fear in the profession. And another figure, which is important, 53%, declared that the analyzed fuel that was off-spec, here one shouldn't be mistaken, it's not 53% overall that was off-spec. It's just that amongst the participants, 53% of the people encountered at least one analysis which was off-spec. These are standards which lay down the specifications for fuels. 32% said that there had been solidification of fuel phenomena. Some fuels contain more paraffin as of 2020. And these are situations where the paraffin becomes crystallized, the fuel solidifies, and blocking up the fuel circuit. 18% the blocking of the injection pumps. These are scenarios which were written up in the guide preparing for compliance. On the right-hand side, you can see a diagram which specifies the parameters which stand out most in the fuel analyses over and above the specifications off-spec. What is clearest are two parameters. First of all, sulfur, which, technically speaking, was not a problem. It was a regulatory issue mainly, because it was banned to use fuel with more than 0.5% sulfur. Second parameter that stands out, the problem of sediment. In fact, that is the parameter which determines the propensity of the fuel to be unstable over time. In other words, this is a chemical parameter. You can see whether the fuel will be stable or not. And that may lead to the creation of sludge, as we saw in the 62%. So that was the first 6 months. A new survey is underway to see whether the market has become more stable, whether the problems have been resolved, because people have more experience now, of course, and better control all the techniques for producing the fuel. Here you can see the compliance of fuels. These are figures reported by the Veritas VeriFuel office. It's quite interesting. One can see that as of February 2020, fuels became more stable. More than 90 or 95% of fuel samples were compliant. That's a very good score. In January, you can see the figures, but as of February, compliance levels are very good. However, there were still problems encountered by crews on a daily basis. However, despite everything, the fuels complied better with the standard. Here on the lower right, you can see out of spec. That indicates the parameters which stand out in this lab study. You can see which parameters are mainly out of spec. Once again, it's mainly sulfur and sediment.
Well, these fuels have one specificity which was anticipated also, but this was confirmed. There is a quality variation for these VLSFO fuels that is major. They are very different in terms of viscosity and density, and that implies that you need to have very strict management on board and the handling of fuels, especially when it comes to temperature management, because at the inlet of the engine, the fuel has the same viscosity, but when you have more viscous fuels than others, they need to be heated more, and that's a management aspect that people needed to get used to. Here you've got 6 graphs that give you information about 6 fuel suppliers. These are graphs with, on the X, the samples that were analyzed and tested, and on the Y, the viscosity at 50 degrees. And here you can very well see very clearly that from one harbor to the next, from one batch to another, from one supplier to the next, you have huge variations that can then result on board into issues of fuels that are not compatible with one another, and that can lead to any number of operational phenomena that ship owners were subject to. So these fuels, you need to understand that in 2019, in order to supply, to reach 0.5%, there had to be a lot of blending with heavy fuel, with light fuel, with solvents and any number of chemicals. And what you ended up with was not always very virtuous. You ended up with fuels that could meet the ISO 8217, but all the other elements could not necessarily be traced, and so you could have some difficulties in terms of operations. What's also important is to compare. You're talking about 2020 fuels for which we know that there were a lot of variations in terms of range and quality, but what about 2018? That's the work by the ISO committee on over 100,000 bunkering operations. They targeted several criteria to see the change in fuels in 2020. And what clearly comes out of it is that for cold flow properties, these are the properties that a fuel has to solidify. Now, since there's more WOX in the fuels, they can set at a relatively high temperature, and it used to be much lower in previous fuels. So you need to manage that very finely. And you can also see here that in 2020 compared to 2018, there are 9 times more fuel samples with characteristics that can lead to these sorts of issues, freezing and setting and crystallization of rocks. Regarding other properties, it's sediment rate, 0.7% of fuels that are out of specs compared to 2018, 0.09. Well, that's 10 times more samples that are unstable. And the catalytic fines, cat fines that were feared that people talked about in 2019, there was a lot of speculation about it. People thought that it would be a disaster. There would be cat fines everywhere. They couldn't be filtered. But it so happened that in the results of the ISO committee, there are 7 times fewer cat fines in 2020 fuels than you had on the market in 2018. A focus on scrubbers. We personally saw very few accidents. Few were recorded, so that's very good news. You have to put that into context because there's less feedback from our contacts about these pieces of equipment, and we think that there's still little feedback about the aging of these facilities, given that a large part were installed in 2019. We're still monitoring the market to see how they're behaving, but so far there haven't been any issues, or at least no major issues. The ships equipped in 2019, so the first ones will have their hull inspections this year or next year. We don't yet have very good visibility and full visibility on that. And just FYI, there are more and more stringent rules gradually on the use of open loop scrubbers. To date, 23 states and 171 harbors decided to ban emissions in their harbor waters or territorial waters. So on CAP low sulfur, you can say that the transition was not easy. It wasn't easy for ship owners. It's still difficult now. They're still having a hard time with management of fuels. However, fortunately, it was not as bad as expected and feared in 2019. No major incidents or pollutions were faced because behind a clogged pump, you can break an engine, but the ship can also get stranded with impacts on the environment. Fortunately, no such situations were faced, so that's a positive. No increase in damage. Fuel problems have existed for a very long time. When you observe, when you read business reports from the cross, you can see that 50% of damage reported has to do with fuel lines and circuits, so that's nothing new. So, however, this milestone was met without any major incidents, but a lot of stress on the part of ship owners and insured parties, so a lot of stress for these people. Increased vigilance must be maintained, especially about monitoring of products and warning notes by some bodies like Lloyd's or CIMAC. Publications, some organizations publish a lot and give very important and interesting information for the shipping world. And last but not least, we can only recommend to maintain best practices that have already been put in place by customers and ship owners, and to keep up efforts in terms of segregation of tanks. You don't mix fuels, or you avoid mixing, testing, enough sampling, and above all, fill out information correctly when people receive samples. There should be traceability between the written documentation and the physical samples in case there are some challenges. That's what we very often notice. The blocking point is lack of traceability, and so that's a break in the chain. So that's it for fuel. The page of low sulfur hasn't been fully turned, but we already need to look at greenhouse gases and CO2 reductions. That's nothing new either, but it's become much more stringent. There have been maybe not new guidelines, but new rules. So very quickly, IMO goals on this. Gradual elimination of greenhouse gas emissions from maritime transport with two intermediate goals: reduce CO2 emissions by at least 40% by 2030, and with an expected reduction of 70% by 2050. All that compared to 2008 figures, with a desire to reduce the total volume of emissions by at least 50% for all greenhouse gases by 2050. Nothing's new here. Already in 2013, systems were put in place, well, standards. And so people started looking at the energy efficiency of trading ships. And so from 2013 onwards, all vessels, new builds, or vessels for which a building order was placed, you needed to calculate the energy efficiency index. That's a theoretical calculation based on the characteristics of the vessel and the fuel that it's going to use. And you needed to compare that figure with reference curves that are on the figure on the right. These curves were set in phases. Each phase was for a building period, with the involvement of the IMO that applied a reduction factor of emissions by 5 to 10% every 5 years, speculating on improvements on shipbuilding and hydrodynamics of hulls. That would get better and better. As soon as the calculation for energy efficiency was lower than the reference curve, the ship could be certified, and additional certificates could be issued for the MARPOL Convention. Then for all existing vessels, this principle was not adopted, but the IMO put a management plan in place for energy efficiency, which is specific to each ship, with reduction goals, how they go about it, how they measure it, how they report. So speed reduction, optimized electric propulsion and routing so that you could emit less. And now there have been fairly recent changes. The IMO closed the 76 Maritime Environment Protection Committee on 8 June. It's very recent. You could read about that in the specialized press. In this committee, it was decided to adopt a measure at short term by 2026. This is both a technical and an operational approach. A technical approach with an energy efficiency index for existing vessels, and also an indicator for carbon intensity. For the EEXI, this new energy efficiency index that will be applicable from 2023 onwards, it's the same, it's very close to what EEDI was for new builds in 2013, but now for all ships above 400 UMS, and that will come into effect from 2023 onwards. Some solutions were suggested, such as limiting power, alternative fuels, design changes, using wind energy, more and more projects with inflatable sails or kite surf sails, rotor sails, in order to save a few tons of fuel and optimize the energy efficiency of vessels so that you can be below the benchmark line to comply with regulations. According to DNV, it is considered that 3,000 vessels will need to adopt technical measures to meet this guideline. All recent vessels should go through this, like plain sailing. For other vessels, it's going to be a challenge. Both for ship owners who will need to fund changes and invest with a short-term vision, it's going to be difficult, but they'll need to comply with this rule, whilst taking into account the economic context, which is difficult. That is the first aspect, and the second one is the carbon intensity index for bigger ships, 5,000 UMS, for which data are going to be collected. It's not a theoretical computation based on the design of the vessel. This is a collection of what the ship emits, and they'll calculate the ratio between the mass of CO2 emitted over its capacity per distance traveled. And this is all going to be calculated, and so you'll have a rating from A to E, similar to what you have with your car, but it's going to change every year. The most virtuous vessels with the best yield will be rated A. C is the middle rating, that's the minimum. Below a C, there will be remediation plans so that they can meet this level. This is very, very recent, and so that's going to enter into force in 2023. And they also have an enhanced development plan for energy efficiency. The goals set by the IMO are 11% reduction by 2026. After 2026, we don't know what is going to be decided. So it's a big uncertainty for ship owners that are going to need to make choices with their eyes partially blindfolded. And then you need to talk about the contribution of the harbors. You're talking a lot about ship owners, but ports also need to get in on it and be involved in decarbonization. We talked about the electrification of quaysides. That's growing more and more. Some harbors have proactive programs like the Environmental Ship Index, a program inciting ship owners to emit less with commercial benefits, and the Green Marine Index, the label for ship owners but also harbors. And that's it for this part. Yes, indeed, you're right on time. Thank you for this, for sticking to your speaking time. I'll just make a small call before I give you the floor, Mr. Lozak. Yes, indeed, the audience can be involved. This is the end of the day, so quite usually, even when you're in the room, you get very few participants, but don't hesitate. This is your moment to ask questions. Well, yes, thank you. By way of conclusion, I think that it's worth pointing out that the maritime world is fully aware of environmental issues. We need to commend our ship owner clients for putting all these solutions in place. And as Pierre-Antoine pointed out, standards are changing very quickly. You can see the 16th committee setting the course for 2023-26. That's tomorrow. And 2030, that can change even further. So you need to commend ship owners for their environmental approaches. It's a full initiative by the maritime world. Insurers are also involved. And on the insurers front, we're really keeping an eye on what's going to happen in the next few years, because these are innovative and new technologies, no feedback on aging. So that's the challenge, both for our ship owner clients and for us insurers for the next few years. Well, I'll ask questions then, because indeed your talks led to some questions. Mr. Ajaj, you were talking about the issues encountered and the fact that crews were better and better trained, but what are the issues in terms of low sulfur that are going to persist potentially in the future? What are the issues that may be plaguing us for a while longer? Well, fuel quality is going to vary a lot. In 2018, vessels that consumed heavy fuel consumed 180 or 380 viscous fuel, and that accounted for 75% of the supply in what was consumed. So you could easily blend two fuels of similar densities and viscosity without anything happening, and that's what they did for a very long time. Now there are such discrepancies, and products that are inserted in the formulations, if you blend, there's a very big risk. And as long as you've got such diversity in products, maybe there will be more uniformity or standardization in fuels. But this is a situation at 1st January. It's still the situation today. And I think it's going to endure a little bit. And it's going to be difficult to get products that are a lot more uniform, as it was the case at least in the near future. Well, yes, indeed, an enduring problem, and we are lucky to have a ship owner around this table. We were talking about the installation of scrubbers. In your experience, what were the particular issues encountered when you installed scrubbers? What was particularly complicated or not? We had two types of installations. We have ships that we chartered where the scrubbers were recently installed, and vessels where we installed the scrubbers ourselves. When we installed ourselves with the same technology, replicated 3 times on the same ship, no worries here. It was fairly quick. And this is the first phase in scrubber installation, depending on the areas covered. And we have a phased plan to go to closed loops. We went for the simplest solution, but since these are fairly recent technologies that were sometimes rushed a bit, sometimes you have vessels where the scrubbers are not fully commissioned, and so you spend a little while, 6 months to 1 year, commissioning everything. You have issues with corrosion that appeared on some vessels, issues with redundancy in equipment that was not high enough for others, but that's part of the learning curve. And now with all of our ships with scrubbers, we have fairly good knowledge, and if you have good control of things, if you choose your technology, well, that's good. And what you said was complementary to mine. You can see that regulations are changing very fast. The 16th committee is just 1 week old, and now we've got new challenges to be faced by 2023, 26. That's very quick. And the issue of following the pace and things changing too much, well, even with all the goodwill in the world, it's difficult to follow the pace of new mandates. And you were talking about investments that may have to be postponed. How do you decide when regulations are changing so fast? Well, trade-offs are going to be complex at some point because there are more and more constraints. COVID emptied the coffers, so we'll need to decide between all that. In France, we're lucky that the Maritime Summit, the Fontenoy Summit, was launched, and so they are going to address that, the defense of the French fleet and environmental aspects, and we'll see in September what will come out of this summit. So yes, that closes the loop. Thank you very much, everyone here, because we started the day talking about this Fontenoy Summit. So this is the end of this first day of the Paramat Days. Thank you, everyone, and see you tomorrow at 10 tomorrow for the presentation of market figures. Thank you so much.